Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Louisiana. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1892, and the small town of St. Fleuret, tucked deep along the bayou south of Baton Rouge, was still more swamp than settlement. Cypress roots broke the soil like ribs, and the air smelled of copper and wet moss. The river carried everything: bodies, rumors, even salvation on the right day. But that summer, it carried something else. The first reports came quietly in July. A farmer named Eustace Dorr was found outside his cabin with bite marks across his forearms. He told his wife he'd been itching from the fever and tried to stop himself from screaming by biting down on his own skin. Within days, half his household was sick, sweating, trembling, their eyes blood-bright, their tongues dry as bark. At first, the local doctor, Dr. Marcelin Vautrin, blamed it on malarial humors, a phrase still common in Louisiana medicine at the time. But as more cases appeared, whole families fevered, hallucinating, muttering to themselves about the buzzing, it became clear that this was no ordinary outbreak. The Louisiana State Board of Health had documented small outbreaks of yellow fever before, like the one that would devastate the state a few years later in 1897. But St. Fleuret's sickness never matched the usual symptoms. No black vomit, no jaundice. Instead, there was the biting. Victims clawed and chewed at their own arms, sometimes at others, as if driven by something beneath the skin. By early August, over 30 cases had been reported. The town constable, Henry Ducote, recorded in his daily log that many of the afflicted appear possessed by itching or inner pressure. They gnaw themselves raw, then fall quiet as if sated. No outside help came. The swamps isolated St. Fleuret, and even the steamboat captains refused to stop after word spread that the fever was catching through breath. On August 19th, Dr. Vautrin sent a sealed letter to Baton Rouge requesting state quarantine support. The letter arrived, but by the time the board replied, no messenger returned from the bayou. The few who dared approach said they saw the town from the water. Empty streets, doors open, laundry stiff on the lines, but not a sound. When finally, weeks later, a small relief crew rode in, they found the entire population of 200 gone. No bodies, no animals, nothing but stains of dark rust on walls and floors where people had once lain. And yet some of the bedding looked oddly smooth, as though it had been washed recently. That was the first record of what newspapers would later call the biting fever of St. Fleuret. At the time, the Louisiana State Board of Health denied it ever existed. But in the archives of St. Landry Parish, there remains a page torn from a physician's logbook, marked with only 2 lines: "The fever hums before it bites, and when it leaves, the silence stays." When the relief crew returned from St. Fleuret, their report was brief and disbelieved. The official notes filed in Baton Rouge that September listed the cause of the town's abandonment as malarial evacuation, a bureaucratic phrase meaning nothing. The men who went upriver swore they saw no one. Yet for weeks afterward, they woke in the night scratching their arms and necks raw, claiming they still heard that hum. One of them, Corporal Lionel Moreau, kept a diary that was later recovered from his family estate. It opens with a line that still circulates in Louisiana folklore. The air sang like bees, but there were no bees. He described entering a schoolhouse where the walls were streaked with blood in thin lines, each mark almost perfectly horizontal, as if made by rows of teeth. The desks were overturned, and in the corner lay a child's shoe, bitten clean through at the heel. On the blackboard, someone had written, Stop the buzzing. Dr. Marceline Vautrin's cabin was the only place that looked orderly. His notes, preserved in the Louisiana Historical Collection, describe the fever's strange progression: restlessness and irritability, compulsion to move the jaw, often clenching, severe itching of the tongue and gums, biting fits, often self-directed, followed by exhaustion and silence. He compared it to rabies, but noted that the victims were not foaming or aggressive. They bit themselves, not others. He called it self-consuming fever. The only body ever found in St. Fleuret was Vautrin's. He was discovered near the levee, seated upright in a rocking chair, his mouth covered with a folded towel. When removed, the towel revealed he had bitten completely through his tongue. His last entry read, "They hum before they break. I can hear them under the floorboards." Officials sealed the site within days, citing sanitation precautions. Locals said they burned the entire settlement, but no official record of a burn order exists. What did survive were stories, passed along steamboat routes and along the Mississippi riverbanks, about a sickness that made the living try to chew their own names from the world. By winter, St. Fleuret was erased from maps. No travelers were permitted beyond St. Landry Parish, and the Louisiana State Board of Health quietly redirected resources to neighboring towns, denying any isolated hysteria had occurred. But in 1893, the steamboat Magnolia Belle reported picking up a drifting skiff half-submerged near Bayou Courtableau. Inside were 3 emaciated figures, 2 men and a girl, alive but incoherent, their mouths bloodied and their hands bandaged. The captain recorded their words in the ship's log. They said they came from the town that bit itself to death. They were quarantined at Port Allen and died within 48 hours. The attending doctor filed his findings under fever of indeterminate strain. But privately, he told colleagues in Baton Rouge something stranger, that their bodies bore no sign of disease. Only their tongues were swollen and teeth cracked down to the root, as if they had spent days gnawing in silence. When the Mississippi thawed that spring, fishermen near St. Fleuret began to find bits of cloth floating downriver, shirt sleeves and kerchiefs torn to strips, each with semicircular holes at the edges as though bitten clean. And one by one, the witnesses stopped sleeping near open windows. By the spring of 1893, when the bayou thawed and the last floodwaters receded, St. Fleuret was little more than a rumor. No one from Baton Rouge dared go back. Yet strange reports began to spread from neighboring parishes, of families growing restless at night, of people waking to find blood on their sleeves, of children grinding their teeth until they bled. A traveling priest, Father Alphonse Gravier, stationed briefly at St. Landry Parish, kept detailed notes of what he called the hum. His letters to the Archdiocese of New Orleans describe visits to parishioners who were convinced the fever carried sound, a vibration felt before it struck. He wrote, "Their bodies are not burning with illness, yet their jaws ache as if fevered. They say they hear it first in their sleep, a trembling in the air like the cry of distant bees." Father Gravier blessed the houses, but within weeks he too fell ill. His handwriting in the later entries grows erratic. Words press deep into the paper. The buzzing will not stop. I bit my tongue tonight. I think it is spreading through the breath. He died in his quarters before dawn. The coroner recorded cause of death as self-inflicted injury under fever delirium. Meanwhile, the Louisiana State Board of Health, already overwhelmed with outbreaks across the Gulf, refused to reopen the St. Fleuret inquiry. But the name began to reappear in letters from doctors posted upriver. Dr. Henry LaSalle, working near Opelousas, wrote to colleagues that several patients arriving from the south exhibited uncommon agitation of the mouth and jaw. He speculated it might be a form of post-rabies hysteria, triggered by fear rather than infection. But his assistant added quietly in the margins, "No bites, no dogs." By midsummer, entire households were quarantined along the river. The pattern was always the same: sleeplessness, jaw tensy, compulsive gnawing of hands or wooden bed frames, then a long silence. Victims stopped responding to their own names. One nurse claimed the sound they made just before death was not a moan, but a hum, a low, continuous vibration that shook the air itself. When a small team of researchers finally reached St. Floret's ruins that autumn, they found nothing but foundations sunk into black soil and fragments of porcelain scattered like teeth. One of the men, Professor Louis de Jean from the New Orleans School of Medicine, took a soil sample for study. He later wrote that the sample, when heated, emitted a faint tone, like glass ringing in the dark. De Jean's lab notes vanished soon after his death, but his wife kept a letter he sent from Baton Rouge weeks later. "It's not fever, it's resonance. Something in that place remembers the hum, and when you stand there long enough, it begins again in your own jaw." After that, no one tried to rebuild. St. Floret was left to the mud and reeds, a ghost town washed clean of people, but heavy with the sound of what they left behind. Even decades later, field workers and hunters passing near the site reported strange sensations: a tightening in the throat, a dull ache behind the teeth, and a faint sound rising from the bayou at dusk. They said it felt less like hearing and more like being heard. By 1894, the story of St. Floret had begun to circulate beyond Louisiana, appearing in brief clippings in the New Orleans Times-Democrat and even in medical correspondence to Harvard's School of Public Health, where it was dismissed as a folk exaggeration of post-fever delirium. But among those who had been near the bayou, the memory of that hum remained tangible, a thing felt in the jaw more than in the ear. Locals said it began again when the air grew damp. Hunters claimed that on still mornings, when the fog lay low across the water, you could hear a vibration rising from beneath the cypress roots. The sound wasn't loud, but steady, like a kettle's faint whistle. No one stayed long enough to find its source. In Opelousas, a traveling apothecary named Jules Bonnet began selling a tonic he claimed prevented the biting fever. His formula was a mixture of quinine and ground clove, which he insisted kept the teeth from turning against the flesh. It sold well among those who lived along the river, but within months, several of Bonnet's customers were found with their jaws locked, hands mauled, the bottles shattered near them. The local constable called it mass hysteria, though each report described the same detail. The victims all seemed strangely calm, as if chewing was an act of prayer. Around this time, a physician from New Orleans, Dr. Elise Fontenot, took interest in the case. She was one of the first women licensed to practice medicine in the state, known for her skepticism toward superstition. Fontenot traveled to the remnants of St. Floret in late autumn and kept a detailed account of what she saw. No houses remain, only outlines in the earth. There is an absence of bird song and a hum beneath the ground that seems to answer footsteps. She collected samples of soil, wood, and fabric, all of which, when brought back to her clinic, reportedly caused a low vibration in the glass jars that contained them. Her assistant, Marguerite Klein, described it as a tremor you could feel through your teeth. Fontenot noted that prolonged exposure caused headaches, jaw pain, and a restless desire to clench the mouth shut. In one entry, dated December 12th, she wrote, "I woke last night biting down on the blanket. I had been dreaming of water boiling, slow, patient, unending." She abandoned her study soon after and destroyed her samples, but not before submitting a report to the Louisiana State Board of Health warning that the St. Floret outbreak might not have been microbial at all. Instead, she proposed an environmental cause, perhaps vibration from the soil or gases trapped in the swamp releasing rhythmic resonance. Her colleagues ridiculed her, calling it female fancy. 2 months later, Fontenot left Louisiana for good. She took a train north and never returned to practice. But a final note, found among her belongings years later, read simply, "Whatever lives there hums in the frequency of hunger." After her departure, the area around the bayou was declared unsafe for agriculture, officially due to ground instability. Unofficially, locals said the land wasn't dead, only waiting. And still, the fishermen of St. Landry Parish claimed that on windless nights, when the water stilled, they could feel the hum rising from below the surface, slow, deliberate, and deep enough to make their teeth ache. By the beginning of 1895, the fever of St. Fleuret had all but faded from public memory. The state had moved on, newspapers stopped printing stories about the biting plague, and officials quietly reclassified the event as a collective episode of nervous disorder. Yet the people who lived near the swamps still refused to enter that part of St. Landry Parish, even when the cypress logs there were said to fetch good money. A few miles from the vanished town stood a trading post owned by Lucien Morel, a Creole merchant whose father had once delivered goods to St. Fleuret. He claimed that in the summers since the outbreak, his dogs would begin growling at dusk, their teeth chattering violently, as if cold. When he tried to steady one of them, he felt the animal's jaw moving, not snapping, but trembling. It was humming, he told a traveling journalist from the Times-Democrat. The article never ran, but Morel's written account survived in the archives of the Louisiana Historical Society. "I do not believe in curses," he wrote, "but that land has rhythm. The fever may have gone, but its song remains." That same summer, a shipment of goods arrived at Baton Rouge University Hospital, including a crate marked Medical Salvage, Bayou Region. Inside were 3 small vials of cloudy liquid, sealed with wax. The inventory tag listed them as samples, St. Fleuret, 1892, property of Dr. M. Vautrin. But Vautrin, the town's physician, had been dead for 3 years when the crate appeared. No one ever discovered who sent it. The vials were sent to Dr. Leland Aubrey, a pathologist known for his research on blood-borne fevers. His assistant later reported that when one of the vials was exposed to air, it emitted a faint sound, not a hiss, but a tone like a plucked wire. Aubrey recorded the phenomenon in his notebook, calling it a persistent acoustic anomaly. He sealed the remaining samples in lead containers and stored them in the hospital's basement. Within 2 weeks, both he and his assistant fell ill. Their symptoms were peculiar. No rash, no fever, no delirium. Instead, they complained of jaw pain and described feeling a vibration in the skull. Their autopsy revealed no cause of death. The lead containers were removed from the hospital the following month and quietly buried on the outskirts of Baton Rouge. When word of the incident reached Dr. Elise Fontenot, now living in Illinois, she wrote to the hospital director, "You have disturbed what wanted silence. The fever was never disease, but resonance. It uses bodies like tuning forks." Her letter went unanswered, but the staff who worked that year would later recall something strange. In the corridor, where the vials had been opened, the floorboards creaked with a constant low pulse, even after repairs were made. In the following years, the state ordered the area permanently quarantined, not for infection, but for acoustic contamination, a term no one had seen before and no one used again. And yet, river pilots traveling down the Atchafalaya began reporting something new, a sound that rose from the water at night, like a breath exhaled through clenched teeth. They called it the hum of the drowned town. By 1896, the name St. Fleuret had vanished from official records, replaced in parish maps by the simple label Restricted Wetlands. But for those who lived near the Atchafalaya River, it remained a whispered warning. Riverboat men claimed that, on nights when the air was still and the moon hung low, the hum could be heard miles upstream, a low vibration that set their lantern glass trembling. In the small town of Melville, a fisherman named René Dugas began selling odd trinkets he claimed were from the bitten town. Among them were bits of porcelain, small bones, and carved wood that rattled faintly when shaken. He said he found them while trapping along a stretch of the bayou where the mud shivered. Locals told him to throw the pieces back, but Dugas kept them, saying the noise reminded him of bees behind a wall. Within a month, he was found dead in his shack, his teeth shattered, his hands clutched tight against his face. The constable's report simply noted, "No sign of struggle, mouth destroyed by self-infliction, jaw locked." The case never reached Baton Rouge, but his belongings were sent to a local physician, Dr. Ira Lejeune, who examined the items Dugas had collected. Lejeune's notes describe an unaccountable resonance when the pieces were handled. Each shard of porcelain or bone seemed to emit a faint hum, especially when placed near the mouth. He locked them in a cabinet, but for weeks afterward complained that his office vibrated softly at night, rattling the glass of his kerosene lamp. The doctor's apprentice, Jean-Paul Trudeau, would later write that the sound followed them home. "It was as if something had learned to hum through us. My teeth ached when I prayed." That same year, reports began arriving from settlements farther east. In Pointe Coupée Parish, several families fell ill with a sickness that resembled what had happened in St. Fleuret years before: restlessness, jaw-clenching, and in some cases self-biting. But there was one new detail. Survivors claimed that before the symptoms began, they heard singing. It wasn't a melody, more a vibration that seemed to rise from the ground itself, like voices murmuring through the soil. The afflicted said it made their gums itch and their jaws tremble. When the sound stopped, they would feel compelled to bite down as though to silence it. Authorities blamed contaminated well water and shut down the settlement for disinfection, but no bacterial cause was found. In her later research, Dr. Elise Fontenot, still corresponding from Illinois, referenced these outbreaks in her private writings. She drew a chilling comparison to the 1897 Louisiana yellow fever epidemic, noting that in both cases, fear spread faster than contagion, but the body behaved as if answering a physical call. Fontenot wrote, "Whatever began in St. Fleuret has learned to travel without blood. It uses memory like air, carried in speech, in prayer, in sound." By then, no one dared speak the town's name aloud. Locals shortened it to Fleur, and even that was whispered, as if saying too much might stir the hum again. And so, for a while, it slept, buried in the mud, humming faintly beneath the new roots of the swamp. But silence in Louisiana never lasts long. By 1897, as yellow fever swept through New Orleans and the Gulf parishes, the hum of St. Fleuret returned in a different form. While most towns faced the fever in silence, doctors stationed near Atchafalaya Basin reported strange new symptoms that didn't match the disease ravaging the cities. In the records of Dr. Leland Aubrey, the same physician who once examined the vials marked St. Fleuret, there appears a new entry dated September 2, 1897, a fever with no heat. The afflicted sweat cold, grind their teeth, and mutter in unison. The sound aligns with no speech I know. It hums at a constant pitch. Aubrey believed it was a neurological response to trauma, a kind of mass hysteria amplified by isolation. Yet his assistant, Nora Pell, described something that science couldn't. In a letter to her sister, she wrote, It isn't madness. The sound has rhythm, like a song sung too low to catch. When they stop humming, they bite their tongues to keep from doing it again. Dozens of similar accounts appeared across Pointe-Coupée, Avoyelles, and St. Landry Parish. Families barricaded themselves indoors, refusing to speak above a whisper. Priests banned hymn singing in some parishes, claiming that the act of unison was an invitation for the fever to return. That autumn, Professor Louis de Jean, the same researcher who once collected soil from the ruined town, returned to Louisiana to study the phenomenon. His notes, later discovered among the papers of Tulane University's medical archive, include sketches of sound waves recorded by early phonographs placed near the bayou. According to his journal, every sample, from air, water, and even tree bark, carried a constant vibration around 56 hertz, low and steady, like the hum of a deep instrument. In one passage he wrote, "I thought the machines were malfunctioning until I stood near the cypress line myself. The hum is real, and it follows no wind." Locals believed it was the souls of the bitten dead, still chewing through the earth to reach air. Others said it was the fever itself, learning to breathe again. When de Jean returned to New Orleans in November, he delivered a brief presentation before the Louisiana Academy of Sciences, warning that the outbreak in St. Florette may have altered something environmental, possibly geological resonance affecting neurological function. He was laughed out of the room. 2 months later, he was found drowned in his study bathtub, the water still vibrating faintly. His widow told police he'd spent his final nights sitting silently in the dark, teeth pressed together so tightly she had to pry his jaw open when she found him. She said he'd started humming the night before he died, a low, steady tone that seemed to echo through the house long after his voice stopped. The coroner called it suicide. The neighbors called it the fever's echo. And down in St. Landry Parish, old fishermen said the hum was louder that winter than it had been in years. The sound, they said, wasn't coming from the swamp anymore. It was coming through it. By 1898, the story of St. Florette had already begun its slow transformation from tragedy to superstition. River pilots refused to navigate the bayou after dusk, and field hands crossing near the Atchafalaya Flats spoke of the singing water. But beneath the folklore, something stranger was taking shape, an effort by the Louisiana State Board of Health to erase all mention of the town from official archives. The directive came quietly. Files on the 1892 outbreak were to be sealed or destroyed. Correspondence referring to the biting fever was reclassified under general fever reports. Maps were redrawn. By the end of the decade, the only people who still used the name St. Florette were the ones too poor or stubborn to leave the parish. That spring, a new physician arrived in Melville, Dr. Samuel Giraud, a recent graduate from Tulane. He'd heard whispers about the phenomenon and intended to disprove it. Giraud kept meticulous notes, later found among his belongings after his death. In them, he describes visiting a farmhouse 6 miles north of the old town site to examine a family afflicted by phantom vibration in the jaw. "Their pulses are normal," he wrote, "temperature steady, yet they claim to feel the teeth moving on their own, like insects in the mouth." He treated them with sedatives and quinine, assuming it was fever hysteria. But on his 3rd night in the house, he recorded something that changed his tone completely. Shortly after midnight, the walls began to hum, not loudly. It was more felt than heard, a slow undulation through the beams. The mother began tapping her teeth together in rhythm. I cannot explain it. By morning, the hum had stopped. But when Giraud tried to question his patients, all 4 had fallen silent, their jaws clenched shut. He left the house and never returned. A few weeks later, he wrote to the Louisiana State Board of Health, suggesting that what plagued the parish might be a phenomenon of resonance and memory. His letter was never answered. The same week it arrived, an internal memo ordered that any field physician mentioning acoustic or psychological contagion be relieved of duty. The following year, Dr. Giraud drowned in the Atchafalaya, his horse found grazing near the riverbank. His notebook washed ashore days later, half the pages eaten away by water. The last legible line read, "It hums in the mouth of the living, because the dead have none left." Meanwhile, locals noticed that the swamp's animals were growing restless. Trappers reported raccoons gnawing at their own paws inside cages, and dogs howling without sound, their throats moving but producing only vibration. The priest who replaced Father Gravier refused to hold Mass within 10 miles of the old town, saying, "There is a choir in the dirt that does not know when to stop singing." By 1899, the fever was no longer a disease or a memory. It had become a sound, one that anyone could catch if they listened too long. And when the new century came, bringing electricity and railroads and progress, the people of St. Landry Parish did something ancient instead. They stopped speaking the name altogether. Because every time someone said Fleurette, the air in their mouths trembled. By the turn of the century, 1900, the last people who had lived near St. Fleurette were gone. The settlement had been swallowed by cypress and mud, the streets invisible beneath new roots and reeds. But the hum, the strange low vibration that once made people bite their own flesh, lingered on, faint yet steady, like a pulse hidden in the land itself. That winter, a rail company began surveying the Atchafalaya Basin for a new bridge. Among their engineers was Mr. Thomas Weller, a practical man from Chicago who knew little of Louisiana folklore. His field logbook, later recovered from the company's archive, begins with confidence and ends in fear. "Locals are wary of the site marked Old Fleurette," he wrote on January 12th. "They say the air there hums. Ridiculous." A week later, "Heard it myself last night. Faint, like iron under strain." The crew grew restless. One man swore his teeth were chattering though there was no cold. Weller noted measurable vibration in the soil, though no geological cause could explain it. His assistant described the sound as a deep resonance that passes through the chest rather than the ears. When the men tried to drive piles for the bridge supports, their drills jammed repeatedly. The ground was soft, but resisted in strange rhythms, as if pushing back. By the third day, several workers complained of jaw pain and nausea. One, Edward Lemaire, began biting the edge of his glove uncontrollably and was sent back to Baton Rouge for observation. Weller's final entry in the log was dated February 2nd. "We must abandon the site. The hum is constant now. I feel it in my bones. Even the air inside my mouth seems to vibrate." The company relocated the project several miles upriver. Months later, Weller drowned in a canal under uncertain circumstances. His body was found with his hands pressed against his face, teeth shattered. The coroner attributed it to industrial accident. Yet strange things continued to happen near the abandoned site. Survey stakes disappeared overnight. Lanterns left burning were found extinguished, the glass still warm. One worker swore he saw ripples moving through the soil, as though something beneath were breathing. By then, the locals had begun calling the area Les Mâchoires, the jaws. Travelers avoided it. Steamboat pilots refused to blow their whistles when passing. They said loud sounds woke it up. In the summer of 1901, a journalist from the Daily Picayune, Miriam Chauvin, ventured into the parish to write a human interest piece on rural superstition. She spent 2 days interviewing residents, most of whom refused to discuss the fever. In her published article, she wrote, "Their fear is not of ghosts or sickness, but of a sound. They believe the earth there remembers what the body once did, that it hums because it cannot forget the hunger." Her editor dismissed it as Southern hysteria. But months later, Chauvin herself fell ill while traveling in Baton Rouge. Her physician reported she suffered severe facial spasms and uncontrollable teeth grinding. Before she died, she reportedly whispered to a nurse, "It's learning to speak again." No one knew what she meant. And yet, river traders passing the old crossing that year described hearing something new, not just a hum, but fragments of rhythm, almost like words forming underwater. Whatever haunted St. Fleuret was no longer silent. It had found its voice. By 1902, the region surrounding the former town of St. Fleuret had fallen under a strange quiet. The last homesteads near the swamp were empty, their porches sinking into mud, their windows long since blacked out. Even the frogs had stopped croaking there, the trappers said. It was as if the bayou had grown tired of its own echoes. Yet that spring, a group of researchers from Tulane University arrived, determined to uncover what had really happened a decade earlier. The expedition was led by Professor Julian Merritt, a geologist with an interest in soil acoustics. He brought with him a small team and a new device, an early vibration recorder that could measure frequencies underground. Their logbooks tell the rest. April 9, 1902. Soil near Fleuret registers consistent pulse at approximately 54 to 57 hertz. Frequency rises with proximity to the old levee, not natural wind nor tectonic movement. At first, Merritt assumed it was resonance caused by trapped gases under the swamp. But when they set up camp, the hum began to follow them, shifting from beneath their feet to within their own tents. His assistant, Emil Hart, wrote, "You feel it in the jaw before you hear it, like your teeth are tuning to the ground." By the fourth night, 2 men refused to continue. They claimed the hum was inside their mouths and begged to leave. Merritt noted the effect with irritation. Hysteria is contagious. But then something happened that made even him falter. Their phonograph, left running overnight, recorded a sequence of low tones that rose and fell in deliberate rhythm. It was no random vibration. The intervals matched human breathing. When they played the wax cylinder back the next morning, everyone felt the same thing, an ache in their teeth and a faint taste of metal on their tongues. Merritt smashed the recording before they left. The expedition returned to New Orleans 2 weeks later, and within months, all 4 members had fallen ill. The symptoms were eerily consistent: jaw spasms, tremors, and a compulsive urge to bite. Medical reports called it neuromuscular disorder of indeterminate cause. The university suppressed Merritt's findings. Years later, a janitor cleaning out his office discovered a single surviving page from his field notes. The sound isn't from the earth. The sound is the earth remembering. It was around this same time that fishermen began reporting another phenomenon. On calm nights, they'd see small ripples spreading across the bayou even when there was no wind, like circles radiating from invisible movement beneath the water. Those who watched too long often complained of jaw pain or nosebleeds by morning. Locals said the fever had finally found a way to breathe. They called the ripples les cercles du chant, the circles of song. And then, as if to confirm their fears, a new outbreak struck the nearby parish of Ville-Platte in late summer. The symptoms matched the old records exactly. No heat, no rash, only the trembling, the hum, and the biting. Doctors sent from Baton Rouge quarantined the area, but no pathogen was ever found. By autumn, The epidemic stopped as abruptly as it began. The parish priest delivered his sermon that Sunday with a single warning. What hums beneath us is not dead. It's only waiting for someone to answer. And from then on, no church bell in the region was ever rung again. The legend of St. Fleuret had grown into something the state could no longer contain. The Louisiana Board of Health still refused to acknowledge the biting fever, but word traveled faster than denial ever could. Merchants in Baton Rouge whispered about the hum disease carried by river air, and a few even claimed it had reached New Orleans itself. That year, Dr. Elise Fontenot, the same physician who had once studied the phenomenon and fled north, returned quietly to Louisiana. She wrote to a colleague in Illinois, "I cannot sleep while it hums. I must see if the earth has forgotten." She journeyed downriver by steamboat, arriving near the Atchafalaya in midsummer, when the swamps steamed like breath. The captain of the St. Jean later described her as calm but distracted, humming softly to herself throughout the voyage. She kept her lips closed, he said, like the sound came from behind her teeth. Fontenot reached Ville Platte, where the recent outbreak had subsided, and set up a small field clinic. She recorded interviews with survivors, men and women who still bore scars along their arms and faces from where they had bitten themselves. None recalled the act consciously. One woman told her, "It was like the song got under my skin. I just wanted to make it stop." That phrase, "make it stop," appeared in almost every testimony she took. In her journal, Fontenot wrote, "It is not infection, it is rhythm. Some frequency the body cannot ignore. Perhaps the fever is memory transferred by vibration, carried through air, through sound, through the living mouth itself." A week later, she ventured into the overgrown basin where St. Fleuret had once stood. Accompanied by 2 local guides, she reached the remains of an old levee at dusk. The ground was soft, pulsing faintly underfoot. Her final written entry reads, "The hum begins low, like distant thunder and the water. The air thickens. The guides have gone quiet. I can feel it in my teeth again." The next morning, her camp was found empty. Her satchel, medical kit, and journal lay near the levee, pages damp and vibrating faintly. One of the guides, Benoit Arsenault, was discovered a mile downstream, half-conscious, his jaw locked shut. When the parish doctor pried his mouth open, he found his tongue shredded and his gums torn to ribbons. The man never spoke again. Fontenot's body was never recovered. The Board of Health listed her as missing due to accidental drowning, but those who lived along the bayou said they saw her once more. They claimed that for several nights after her disappearance, a pale figure walked the levee at dusk, her lips moving soundlessly, the water rippling in perfect circles around her feet. By the next season, the levee collapsed into the swamp, and just like that, the place where Dr. Fontenot had stood, the last known scientist to study the fever, was gone, reclaimed by the same silence that had swallowed St. Fleuret 11 years earlier. But locals swore that the humming changed after that. It was no longer deep and steady. It sounded lighter, almost human, almost like a woman softly singing through her teeth. By 1904, the hum had spread beyond the swamp, finding its way into stories, letters, and even prayer. The people of St. Landry Parish called it La Voix du Sol, the voice of the soil. Those who lived near the Atchafalaya claimed it followed them indoors, settling in walls and furniture, humming faintly under beds at night. A few skeptics tried to debunk it. Among them was Professor Walter Brigham, an engineer from New York sent south to investigate reports of atmospheric interference. He arrived that spring, armed with instruments to measure vibration. In his report to the U.S. Geological Survey, he described the landscape as acoustically alive. "It is not a sound one hears so much as one feels," he wrote, "a pressure inside the jaw and ears, a subtle trembling that sinks to heartbeat and breath." He dismissed the stories of madness and self-biting as mass hysteria, attributing the phenomena to subterranean resonance from trapped swamp gases. Yet his own notes tell another story. A private entry in his field journal reads, "Last night, I dreamed of a low tone moving through water. It woke me. My mouth ached. I found blood on my pillow." Brigham left Louisiana 2 weeks later. His assistant, Henry Cormier, stayed behind to finish packing the equipment. When the shipping crates arrived in New York, one was marked, "Do not open, contains noise." Cormier was never seen again. Meanwhile, the locals began noticing odd changes in the environment. The cypress trees near the old levee grew warped, their trunks twisted in gentle spirals. The soil beneath them pulsed faintly, warm even in winter. Fishermen said their nets snagged on something soft and rhythmic, like muscle beneath the mud. They stopped fishing there altogether. In one parish church, the priest forbade congregational singing, saying that the fever lives in harmony. Parishioners prayed in Sill, ence for months until Easter Sunday, when a child began humming during Mass. Witnesses claimed the note carried through the room like wind through a bottle. Within seconds, everyone's teeth began to ache. The priest fainted at the altar. When he woke, he told his congregation, "The ground remembers what the mouth forgets." That phrase spread through the region like a warning. No one sang after that. By late summer, letters began reaching Baton Rouge from families who'd moved far from the swamp, but still claimed to hear it. Some wrote of waking in the night to find their beds shaking gently, or their mirrors trembling with no breeze in the room. Others said they felt something moving in their gums, small vibrations that made them clench their jaws till they bled. The Board of Health, desperate to contain panic, sent circulars advising people not to discuss the hum publicly, fearing the idea itself had become contagious. But the damage was already done. The sickness that began in St. Florette had evolved beyond fever and flesh. It now lived in sound, passed quietly from one listening ear to another. And the old people said that once you'd heard it, even once, it stayed with you forever. Because the hum, they whispered, doesn't stop when you stop hearing it. It stops when you start making it. By 1906, the phenomenon once known as the biting fever had become something unspoken, a silence inherited like blood. Families who had fled St. Landry Parish refused to talk about their origins, and those who stayed claimed that remembering aloud could wake the soil. Even so, the hum persisted. That year, a small group of researchers from Tulane University's medical department conducted what would be the final sanctioned investigation into the region. Their team leader, Dr. Amos Kell, was a cautious man who believed what he called psychogenic epidemics could infect entire communities through belief alone. He brought sound instruments, mercury thermometers, and, against local advice, a phonograph recorder. In their first week at the bayou, the team camped near what maps still labeled wetlands, unfit for cultivation. The first night was uneventful. On the second, the phonograph recorded faint interference, like breath moving across the mouthpiece. By the third, the interference had become rhythmic. Dr. Kell's assistant, Miss Abigail St. Cyr, transcribed the sound as steady syllabic pulses, almost linguistic. She believed it might be swamp vibration altered by humidity. But when they slowed the recording on the cylinder, a pattern emerged, 5 deep tones, 1 pause, then a rise, like something trying to form a word. Kell wrote, "There is repetition, but no logic. It is as if the land is stammering." On the 5th night, 2 assistants packed their equipment and fled, claiming their teeth hurt like they were vibrating loose. The remaining members stayed another day, determined to prove the sound mechanical or geological. That evening, at sunset, the hum began again. Not from the ground this time, but from the tents themselves. Every object with a hollow cavity, bottles, flasks, tin cups, began to tremble in harmony. St. Cyr's notes end mid-sea. Intense. The phonograph needle is moving on its own. It is playing without the cylinder. The rescue team that arrived 2 days later found the camp empty. The tents were still standing. In the center of the site lay the phonograph, its needle vibrating steadily in silence. The wax cylinder was missing. For years afterward, hunters claimed they could hear a faint recording coming from that patch of swamp, as if the machine had never stopped playing. No one ever recovered Dr. Kell or his assistants, though one of their packs was later found downstream, wedged in a tree fork. Inside was a single page from his journal, warped by moisture. It read, "The fever is no longer illness. It is recollection. The body hums what the ground remembers." After this, the state of Louisiana declared the entire area condemned, forbidding habitation or research. But it didn't stop the stories. Locals said that every few summers, the sound came back, stronger, clearer, closer. They said you could hear words in it now, fragments of prayers mixed with teeth grinding, as if hundreds of voices were trying to bite through time itself. And those who lingered too long near the bayou left with more than ringing ears. They left humming. By 1908, Louisiana's officials had stopped sending doctors and scientists to the Atchafalaya altogether. The old site of St. Florette was now a forbidden zone, marked on state maps with a thin black X. Locals said the ban wasn't because of disease, it was because of sound. That year, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers planned to dredge a new canal through the basin to improve shipping routes. The project supervisor, Captain Robert E. Salter, ignored warnings from parish elders. He wrote in his official report, "The men are fearful of a hum beneath the soil, likely superstition. The swamp exhales gas. They hear music in it." Salter's team began work in April. Within days, the dredge machinery started malfunctioning. Iron rivets loosened on their own. The hulls of their barges vibrated at night even when the engines were off. Men complained of jaw pain and dizziness, some refusing to eat because their teeth itched. By the second week, one worker went mad and leapt into the bayou, biting at the water before he sank. The rest of the crew deserted soon after. Salter remained, determined to finish his survey. His final log entry, found smeared and water-damaged, read, "It's not gas, it's rhythm. It matches the pulse." 3 days later, a patrol boat found the dredge drifting, its engines silent. Salter's body was discovered on the deck, eyes open, lips drawn back as if mid-song. His tongue had been bitten through. After the tragedy, the Corps quietly abandoned the canal project. But by then, something far stranger had begun to spread. Settlements miles away from the basin reported phantom humming in wells and cellars. A few farmers claimed their livestock refused to drink from standing water, growling at it like an enemy. One woman, Mrs. Clarice Gautreau, living in a parish 20 miles from Florette's ruins, wrote in her diary, "The hum came into the H's, house tonight. I heard it through the floorboards. I prayed, but my teeth kept moving." Her husband later found her on the porch at dawn, bloodied but alive, a handkerchief stuffed into her mouth to stop herself from biting. By this time, the newspapers had caught wind of the cursed parish. Headlines read, "The land that hums, the bayou that sings, and survivors of the biting fever speak again." Most readers dismissed them as pulp sensationalism, but the articles stirred something in the state's collective memory. Scholars at Tulane and Louisiana State University privately revisited the old medical reports. one archivist discovered a torn scrap from Dr. Vautrin's 1892 notes, the town's original physician. In faint, fading ink it read, "The fever is not caught, it is heard, and once you hear it, the mouth remembers." After that discovery, the file was sealed and never catalogued again. By 1909, parish boundaries were redrawn, effectively erasing St. Fleuret from all official records. But the people who lived near the water swore they could still hear the hum on still nights. They said it no longer came from the ground or the air, but from the river itself. Old men sitting on docks after sunset described it best. "The water's breathing," they'd whisper, "and when it exhales, the land listens." By 1910, the legend of St. Fleuret had crossed parish lines and entered the realm of fearful fascination. Riverboat men called it the town that bit itself to death. Preachers called it God's silent punishment. But among those who lived near the Atchafalaya Basin, it was known simply as the hum. That year, a physician named Dr. Marion Roux, a skeptic trained in modern bacteriology, moved to St. Martinville, not far from where the swamps swallowed the old town. He came chasing truth and ridicule in equal measure. He called it the fever myth, convinced he could disprove a generation's superstition with science. At first, he found nothing, no infections, no tremors, just mud and wind. But the longer he stayed, the more his journals began to shift in tone. His first entry, written in May, was confident. No fever, no contagion, only memory and ignorance. By July, that confidence had turned to unease. Locals are right about one thing. The air vibrates here. Even the water quivers against the shore when no breeze stirs it. And by August, he had written only 2 words across several pages: jaw aches. Roux had set up his clinic near an abandoned ferry landing, once used to cross towards St. Fleuret. He treated farmers complaining of pressure in the skull and itching teeth. He told them it was nerves, prescribed rest and quinine, yet he began showing the same symptoms within weeks. In one surviving letter to his sister, he wrote, "It is as though something hums inside my jaw, and when I speak, it hums back. I fear it is not madness, but resonance, like standing inside a bell and waiting for the strike." He was last seen on a rainy evening in September, walking toward the bayou barefoot, carrying a lantern and his stethoscope. His assistant, Jonas Pelletier, followed at a distance and claimed to have heard 2 tones in harmony before the light went out. Roux's body was never found, though his stethoscope washed ashore days later, the metal warped and humming faintly when touched. That same year, the Louisiana Geological Survey investigated tremors reported along the lower river valley. Their report, filed, printed, and then quietly withdrawn, listed no seismic activity but noted persistent low-frequency vibrations at the site of the former town known as St. Fleuret. The word acoustic anomaly appeared several times, underlined. Shortly afterward, the state condemned the surrounding wetland entirely, banning fishing and habitation. It was declared environmentally unstable. But locals said the truth was simpler. The ground there was still singing, and the sound drove men to bite and prey. In nearby Bro Bridge, an old fisherman named Henri Doucet told a traveling reporter, "It's not the sickness that kills. It's the waiting for the next hum. That's when people start chewing, to feel alive, to drown it out." After Doucet's interview, his shack burned down mysteriously. The reporter later said he still heard the man's voice on his phonograph cylinder, though he had not recorded their talk. "There's something there," he told his editor, "under the static." By then, no one dared enter the old parish, not even the priests. And yet the hum did not stop. If anything, it began to travel. Through water, through wind, through the very breath of those who remembered. Because the people of Louisiana learned something terrible that year. The fever didn't need a town anymore. It just needed a listener. By 1912, the Atchafalaya Basin had reclaimed the last visible traces of St. Florette. Maps labeled the area simply as uncharted swamp, and new settlers were warned not to linger after dark. But still, strange travelers came, scholars, journalists, the curious, all drawn by the stories of a place that hummed. Among them was Professor Eleanor Gray, an anthropologist from Boston who specialized in collective memory phenomena. She arrived in Louisiana that spring, intending to document how entire communities could create a shared delusion. The locals refused to speak with her. Those who did said only, "If you listen for it, it'll listen back." Gray stayed in a rented shack near Breaux Bridge, within walking distance of the condemned zone. Her first letters home were confident, almost dismissive. "I hear nothing unusual here, only frogs and the slow settling of mud. It's strange that the imagination can turn silence into sound." A week later, her tone shifted. "There's a rhythm in the stillness. Not a noise exactly, but pressure. It makes the walls shake when the air is still." She began waking with her teeth clenched, her jaw sore. In one letter, she described biting her lip so hard in her sleep that she woke to the taste of blood. She blamed fatigue, but in her journal, she wrote something darker. "It hums when I write about it, as if the ink itself carries vibration." By late May, she ventured into the swamp accompanied by a local guide, Armand Dupré, who refused to cross into the old parish boundary. "The ground sings," he warned, "and it sings to be answered." Gray went on alone. She never returned. 2 days later, Dupré found her notebook hanging from a cypress branch. The final entries were smeared and uneven, written in bursts between long blank spaces. One line repeated over and over, "The hum is a memory trying to eat its way out." The last peg, he bore what appeared to be transcriptions of sound, short bursts of repeated syllables, ending with a shaky scrawl. "It's learning our names." After her disappearance, the locals burned the surrounding brush and closed all river passages through the basin. But travelers said the smoke itself seemed to vibrate. One fisherman claimed he heard humming in the ashes, low and wet, as if the swamp were sighing. Later that year, a small-town preacher in Lafayette delivered a sermon titled, "The Lord's Quiet Wrath." He warned that the fever had never been sickness but remembrance, the earth rehearsing the sins of men. He spoke so softly, the congregation had to lean forward to hear him. Then, mid-sermon, he froze. Witnesses said his teeth began to chatter, and a low hum filled the church walls. He bit through his tongue before they could reach him. By 1913, silence became a rule in the parishes bordering the basin. Children were told never to whistle, never to hum, never to speak the word Florette. Even the river pilots crossed themselves when they passed that stretch of water, because by then the people understood what the fever had truly become. It was no longer in the body, it was in the sound. By 1914, Louisiana had all but buried the story of St. Florette beneath official silence. The war in Europe drew attention elsewhere, and the state archives conveniently lost most of the original medical reports. But those who lived along the Atchafalaya knew the hum had not gone. It had simply grown quieter, patient, steady, waiting. That summer, a freight train passing through Melville stopped unexpectedly near the swamp. The engineer, Joseph Raines, later claimed the locomotive began to vibrate as if running over an unseen bridge. His account, recorded by a federal inspector, describes the steel rails singing under the wheels. "We thought it was the boiler," he said, "but the sound came from the ground. It matched the rhythm of the pistons, like the earth was keeping time." Within a week, several men from that crew reported headaches and toothaches. 2 were hospitalized after tearing open their own gums with their fingernails. The inspector's official statement blamed chemical fumes from the swamp, though none were detected. Meanwhile, towns near the basin began noticing another odd phenomenon: shallow wells filled with clear water that trembled slightly on the surface. Children would drop pebbles in and watch the ripples overlap perfectly, as if something beneath the water was breathing in time. One family, the Lejeunes, moved after their youngest son began humming in his sleep. "It's calling," the boy told his mother, from under the house. The fear returned quietly, like fever through old blood. By autumn, the State Geological Survey revisited the area with seismic instruments. The readings, though never published, showed periodic vibrations deep underground. Not random tremors, but patterned resonance every few minutes, low enough to be felt in the jaw. The report ended with a single handwritten line by one of the technicians: "The hum is not fading. It's multiplying." That same year, an old fisherman named Henri Doucet, one of the last living witnesses to the original outbreak, was interviewed for a small local paper. His words were calm, almost reverent. "It's not evil. It's memory. The land remembers the fever like a song it cannot stop singing." He died 2 days later in his sleep. Neighbors swore they heard humming through his walls that night, even though his house had no electricity. Soon after, a drought hit the basin, and the river receded to reveal the foundation stones of a lost settlement, perhaps the bones of Saint Fleuret. Among the ruins, workers found fragments of porcelain, buttons, and what appeared to be human teeth fused together in clumps, smooth like river rock. The artifacts were gathered for study, but during transport, the wagon driver overturned into the water. The items sank and were never recovered. Locals said the swamp took back what was its own. By winter, the parish fell silent again. No singing, no whistling, no laughter at the docks. Mothers hushed their children even at play. They said sound traveled too far there, that if you spoke too loud, the air might hum back. And so the story of Saint Fleuret became what it always wanted to be, not a tale told aloud, but one carried inside the mouth, quiet, throbbing, alive. They say if you put your ear to the ground near the old levee, you can still hear it, not loud, not angry, just steady, like something waiting to be remembered. By 1915, the land that had once been Saint Fleuret was gone from maps and conversation alike. Floods had washed over the basin again, swallowing what little remained of the settlement's bones. But even after the river changed its course, the sound endured, not in the swamp, but in the people who still lived near it. Letters from that year tell of farmers waking before dawn to a faint vibration beneath their beds. Horses refused to drink from the bayou. Windows trembled though there was no wind. In Breau Bridge, a teacher dismissed her class early when the blackboard began to hum softly against the wall. "It was the same pitch as a heartbeat," she later wrote, "and I could feel it behind my teeth." The State Board of Health, desperate to erase the association, issued its last official statement on the matter. No such community as Saint Fleuret is known to exist, nor has any fever by that name ever been recognized. But those who lived through the hum knew better. They said denial only fed it. By the 1920s, the story had become legend, a caution whispered to children about the danger of listening too closely. Preachers in the river towns changed their hymns to silent prayers. Fishermen tapped their teeth before crossing the water. a charm to keep the song from starting. And still, every few years, someone would vanish while walking too near the flooded ruins, their boat found adrift, their oars untouched. Decades later, a surveyor laying new telephone lines through the Atchafalaya lowlands struck something buried just beneath the mud, a patch of dense gray earth that vibrated against his shovel. He called for help, but by the time his crew arrived, the spot had gone still. They found nothing but a faint hollow in the soil, perfectly round, as if made by sound rather than hand. He left Louisiana soon after, refusing to work near water again. The Last Rise. A mention of St. Fleuret appeared in a private letter dated 1931, written by a historian named Marion Cormier to a colleague in Baton Rouge. He closed with these words: "I do not believe the fever ever ended. I believe it learned the shape of silence. Perhaps that is what hums beneath us still, not death, but what death left unfinished." The letter was never sent. And so the story of the town where the fever made people bite themselves ends as it began, in the swamps of Louisiana, where sound becomes memory and memory becomes hunger. Even now, locals say that on still nights, when the mist rises and the bayou lies smooth as glass, you can hear a faint vibration traveling through the water. It moves softly, like breath under prayer. If you stand there long enough, you'll feel it too. A hum rising through your jaw, patient and steady, asking to be answered. And that's when the elders say you must step back, close your mouth, and walk away without a word. Because if you listen too long in St. Fleuret, you don't just hear the fever, you begin to hum it back.